Welcome to Authors at Google. We're in the Santa Monica office, and we here at this office are very pleased to have Sasha Watson here to discuss her book, Vidalia in Paris. And we look forward to hearing her discuss it. And without further ado, I will turn the podium over to her. Thank you, Sasha.
Thanks, Chris. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for coming today. So my first book is just out in October. October 2nd it came out. And it's called Vidalia in Paris. You all have it there in front of you. And it's a novel for young adults. It's ages 12 and up. And I was revising this book when I worked at Google. So I went through a couple of revisions. So a lot of you saw me go through that process a little bit. And now the book is finally out. And I'm currently working on a second book on another young adult novel. This one is about an unrelated character. It's a different story entirely, but it is YA. One of the first questions I often get asked when I tell people that I write for teenagers is why? People ask me this in conversation. They ask in Q&A question and answer periods after readings. And often the question is, a friendly sort of what do you do, why do you do it, how does it work kind of question. But sometimes the question is followed by another question that's some variation of, so is your next novel going to be for adults? And I think it's really interesting that so many people seem to consider writing for teenagers a stepping stone on the way to writing for adults. And maybe they think this in the same way that once we're adults, we might think back to our teenage years as just a stepping stone on the way to becoming the people that we are now, the sort of real people that we are now, as if we were less real when we were younger. This seems to me to be a misconception both of adolescence and of its literature. And the question also seems to take for granted two things. One, that adolescent experience itself is less worthy of discussion than adult experience. And two, that teenagers are less worthwhile readers than adults. In other words, if you're going to write about teenagers, then why not address it to adults? Never mind that the line isn't very clear between adult fiction and teen fiction. Once you really start to parse what is YA, what's not YA, if you've got a teen character in an adult novel, it gets very fuzzy very quickly. And ultimately, the answer that you can come up with is it's marketed to teenagers, it's marketed to adults. That's really the only defining line. But if we freeze the world, right where we are, there are people of all different ages having all different experiences. Whether it's a 3-year-old, a 15-year-old, a 40-year-old, a 75-year-old, everything that these people are experiencing is equally a part of the fabric of life. And who's to say that some of these experiences are more important or more literary than others? So this is all just to make the point that the question itself is a questionable one, and that writing about these issues and for this audience is very much a literary destination rather than a stepping stone towards something else. So to answer the question why I write for teenagers, I have a few different answers. The first has to do with my particular creative obsessions. By the time I decided to write young adult fiction, I'd done lots of other kinds of writing. I'd been a reporter for a weekly newspaper. I'd done a lot of freelance writing, publishing book reviews, interviews, articles in magazines and journals and on websites. I'd spent a number of years immersed in the experimental poetry world of New York, publishing poems and reviews in magazines. I'd gone to graduate school where I'd written academic work, primarily about French poetry. And I'd also published translations of French poetry and prose. All of those things were good and valuable, and some of them I continue to do, but none of them offered me the particular richness and joy that writing young adult novels does. So in order to explain that richness and what I get out of writing this kind of fiction, I'll tell you a little bit about my own adolescence. Middle school was hell for me. I switched from a tiny school where I'd known everyone since birth, practically, in 6th grade, and moved into a large public school. The girls at this school were way different than the girls that I'd known before. They had hair that crested in glistening waves around their faces. They wore blue eyeshadow. They used swear words. And on Monday mornings, they came into school talking about what they'd done down the quarries, where they'd been drinking with high school boys, and scooping, the weird word for making out that seems only to have been used in the suburb of Boston where I lived. I was a quiet kid. I read a lot, and my greatest fantasy had to do with going back in time to Prince Edward Island in the late 1800s, where I would live with my soul sisters, Anne of Green Gables and Emily of New Moon. From 6th through 8th grade, the things I liked, writing nature poems, reading, doing well in school, earned me ceaseless mockery. Then in 9th grade, my parents took pity on me and sent me to a different school, a school that was small and where everyone liked to read. In the next 4 years, I largely became the person that I am today. I became cosmopolitan, taking the subway in and out of Boston and Cambridge every day. I became someone who watched movies, went to museums, went to indie rock shows. The doors of the wider world sprung open, and they did it all at once. Suddenly, I was a part of the cultural world. Suddenly, people were telling me that I could go on to help make that world as a creative, intellectual person. Had I not changed schools when I did and started spending my days in the city instead of the suburbs, becoming friends with the children of Cambridge academics, being exposed to art and culture in a way that I hadn't before, then I guess I probably would have come into myself anyway. Maybe it would have happened more slowly, over a longer period of time, bit by bit. But instead it happened all at once. Because that moment was so dramatic for me, it hooked my imagination. I go back to it again and again. The stories that fascinate me swirl around it. There's so much going on at that time of life, in that freeze frame of adolescence. It's when a person starts to define herself, often in contrast to her family. It's when she develops her own intellectual and creative interests. It's when she begins forming the image of herself that she'll pursue and realize over the rest of her life. Of course, a lot is lost then, too. The comforts and the safety of childhood, the safety of the closed family are lost. That breaking point between childhood and adulthood is painful, but it's also beautiful, and it's full of hope and visions of what's possible. It's the part of human life that's most fully alive to my particular creative mind. Vidalia in Paris is about that moment. It's about a girl who leaves the safety of home to test herself in the world, to take risks and see what she can find in a new place, in love, and finally in herself as an artist. As I wrote the book, I started to realize that there was something else going on in this writing, though, something that I hadn't experienced before in writing other things. I found that I had something urgent to say to the person I imagined reading this book, to girls, and to boys, too, of that age. I wanted to tell readers that they, too, could live the life that they wanted to live, that they could break free from whatever restrictions were placed on them by family, by school, by where they lived, that they could create art, and that they could shape the world. This goes beyond the writing itself. Another part of what I want to do as a YA writer is to talk to young people, to go into classrooms and libraries and wherever kids who crave encouragement can be found. And I want to use whatever authority they might attach to my status as adult and author to look them in the eye and to tell them that they too can do this. This adds a whole new layer of richness to my life as a writer. And I do this in a few ways. I do school visits, I do creative writing workshops with young people, and I also work with an organization called Write Girl, which pairs writers up with girls, with middle and high school girls in Los Angeles, and offers writing coaching to girls who wouldn't otherwise have access to it. I was really lucky to be where I was as a teenager, to go to the school that I went to, and to have the family that I had. But I would really like all girls, wherever they are, whatever their circumstances are, to have the opportunity to see themselves in a new way, and to have their eyes open to their own potential and to the ways that they can influence the larger world. So that's another important reason why I write for this audience. My final reason for writing YA is the simplest, and it's just that it's so much fun. The focus is on story, for one thing, and story is fun. As we all know in Hollywood, there's so many screenwriters out there telling stories, so many stories here. Writing in order to grab hold of a reader in the first chapter and then hold on to them, pull them along until the end. The process of creating that ride is really great. It's difficult, but it's also a lot of fun once you start to get moving. And the industry is fun too. I was just reading an interview with Julie Just, who's the children's books editor at the New York Times. And she was the deputy editor of the book review at the Times before she switched over. And this was a few years ago. As she made that switch, she talked about the tremendous vitality of young adult novels these days. And there really is a tremendous vitality in the industry right now. It's exploded in the past 10 years. And in that time, writers have really been given license to tell stories to teenagers, not to their teachers, not to their parents, and without filters, speaking really from the experience of adolescence and to adolescence. So those of us writing for teenagers today are really deeply engaged in teenage experience, in exploring it and analyzing it and doing our best to describe it honestly. There's something really fresh, exciting, and free about the whole endeavor. So why is young adult fiction the destination for me as a writer? Because adolescence is just where my creative mind lives. Because I have a deep desire to speak to these people, to reveal the potential of young people to themselves, and because it's really fun. So I am now going to read you guys a chapter from Vidalia in Paris, now that I've explained my mission here. And let me see. Vidalia lives with her mother in East Hampton. She's an only child. Her mother doesn't leave the house very much, which is a situation that's been developing over the course of a couple of years prior to the beginning of this book. And Vidalia, as you'll see, cares for her mother. And she's now received a scholarship to study art in Paris. She's an artist. She has won the art show at her school and done very well. And she's off to Paris to undergo sort of rigorous art training in France. So where we start here, she has arrived in Paris and is now with her host family. And she'll be going to an art class, and you'll see that some of the relationships start off with some difficulty as she, is dropped into a brand new place, a new culture with new people. Vidalia. She buried her face in her pillow. Whoever was yelling at her would probably stop if she ignored them. But who was it? For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Vidalia, you must come now. Oh, right. Paris. Clara. Okay, Vidalia said weakly, trying to remember how great it was going to be to have a little sister for the summer. There was a pounding on the door. Okay, she said, more loudly this time. Silence. Vidalia, Clara yelled. What? Vidalia realized too late that she'd answered in the voice she would have used with her mother, that is, highly irritated. She winced with regret and threw her hand over her eyes. What time was it anyway? How long had she slept? My mother says you have your class at the Beaux-Arts very soon, and you'll be late if you don't come now. There was another pause, and then, in shocked disapproval, you slept since yesterday afternoon. No wonder she felt so out of it. Okay. Vidalia removed her arm from her face and opened her eyes to see the blue sky framed in the window above her. Vidalia lives in a chambre de bonne, which is, in Paris, the apartments tended to have these rooms that were maids' rooms on the top floor of the building. So the top floor will have a series of little one-room, just bedrooms. And that's where Vidalia is, so she's separate from the family. I'll be right down, she said. A second later, she heard Clara's footsteps head off down the hall. She sat up, suddenly taking in what Clara had said. She needed to shower, brush her teeth. She could feel the grime of the trip and the long night of sleep as she rose. Once she'd gone downstairs, showered and dressed in a black skirt and Strokes t-shirt, She wandered out to the kitchen to find Clara waiting impatiently for her. "There's toast for you there. Hurry, I'm late for my dance class," the little girl said. "My mother will meet us on the street." Vidalia picked up the toasted baguette, which had been buttered and spread with jam, and followed Clara out into the hallway. She pressed the button for the elevator. When they'd squeezed into the tiny octagon, Clara reached into her bag and pulled out a cell phone, which she handed to Vidalia. "Tiens," Clara said. "My mother said to give it to you. It's an extra portable phone." "Thanks," said Vidalia, taking it from her. "How do I know what the number is?" "It's there," said Clara, "on tape on the back. It used to be mine, but I got a new one that is much nicer. It can take photographs." The little girl looked disdainfully up at Vidalia. Madame Dubois met them in the car at the curb, and as soon as they got in, she took off, whipping around corners and gunning the engine whenever they approached a traffic light. She also talked a mile a minute all the way to the studio, telling Vidalia how to use the metro and the public phones and how she shouldn't go home with strange men. Vidalia considered feeling insulted about that last one, but decided it wasn't worth the energy. Her mind was on her art class. For the past year, she'd been yearning for somebody to challenge her and show her how to do new things. Mrs. Greenberg was encouraging, but Vidalia felt like she'd learned as much as she could from her. Laurent Benoit might teach her something that Mrs. Greenberg couldn't. Madame Dubois pulled up in front of an old stone building right by the River Seine. "Here you are, Vidalia," she said, handing her a small zippered purse. "There's a phone card there. Call us when you're done." Vidalia thanked her and waved goodbye to Clara, who stared blankly at her from the back seat. Now out of the car and all alone, Vidalia looked up at the imposing stone building. She walked inside and turned down a quiet, airy hallway. The room numbers climbed as she walked, and her nervousness grew along with them. When she reached room 16, which was the number written on her information packet, she paused in front of the big wooden door, listening for voices. Nothing. She lifted her hand to the knob and slowly turned it. The room was darker than she'd imagined it, sort of gloomy and dim, but it was big, with a high ceiling, and it was full of white plaster casts of heads and hands and feet. There were easels stacked against the far wall, and there was a strong, oily smell in the air. This was nothing like Mrs. Greenberg's art room, with its watercolors and boxes of pom-poms. This was a real art studio, an atelier, as it was called in French. Across the room, a cluster of 8 or so students, all about Vidalia's age, kneeled on the floor, working on something she couldn't quite see. To her left, she noticed an older man in paint-spattered clothes standing by a big sink. That must be Laurent Benoit, the wise old art teacher she'd imagined. "Excusez-moi," she said, when she was just a few feet from him. He looked up, turning off the tap and shaking a handful of wet brushes into the sink. "Je m'appelle..." "You're the American," he said in French, and he stuck the brushes in a glass jar. "Oui," she said, relieved to be recognized. "I'm..." But again he cut her off. "You're late," he said, fixing her with watery blue eyes. Vidalia's own eyes widened with surprise. This wasn't the welcome she'd expected, and she was only, 10 minutes late? Laurent Benoit spun around and headed across the room to where the others were crouched on the floor. Vidalia hurried to follow him. "Here," he said when she reached him. He handed her a pale wooden frame and a piece of canvas that he cut from a big roll. When she looked down at the other people, she saw that they were all stretching canvas onto their own wooden frames. "Monsieur?" Vidalia asked, but he was already walking away. She'd never done this before. Okay, she guessed she was about to try, though. She got down on her knees and glanced at the guy next to her as he pulled the canvas over one edge of his frame with a small pair of pliers, then hit the corners with a stapler. Then he flipped the whole thing to the side and did it on another side of the frame. Vidalia pulled the canvas tight the way he had and picked up his pliers and his stapler once he was done with them. But even though she tried to mimic what he'd done, hers came out crooked. The guy next to her looked down at her canvas and then back at her, one eyebrow raised, his brown hair falling into his eyes. Vidalia frowned. He didn't have to be smug about it. She pulled at her canvas with the pliers again and stapled, but the stapler slipped and hit the wood at an angle. A pair of paint-spattered leather boots appeared in her line of vision. She looked up to see Monsieur Benoit and sat back on her heels, hoping for some friendly advice. "You ask for help when you need it," he said in a not-so-friendly voice. "We don't waste materials here." He took the rumpled canvas from her. "You work over here today," he said. He walked to an easel on the other side of the room and dropped a box of charcoal next to it. Then he picked up a big sketch pad from a table nearby and put it on the easel. "Draw this," he said, pointing at a plaster bust on a pedestal nearby. Some of the other students glanced over at her, including a girl with long blonde dreadlocks who gave her a sympathetic smile before turning back to her own canvas. Vidalia felt like she'd gotten a time out on her first day of preschool. The morning seemed like it would never end. Vidalia worked on her sketch while the other students stretched canvases and then painted a still life together. When it was finally time to clean up, Monsieur Benoit walked by, glanced at her sketch, grunted, and went over to talk to the guy who'd smirked at Vidalia's failed canvas. Some teacher. Vidalia rolled up her sketch and shoved it in her bag. As the class gathered by the sinks, Monsieur Benoit looked at Vidalia. She felt herself cringe when his eyes landed on her. "Our colleague, Mademoiselle Sloane," he said in French, "arrived too late for our earlier introductions. She comes to us from the American Institute, and she has already demonstrated that country's well-known lack of economy." Vidalia stiffened. "I hope that she will join us in our European efforts to preserve our artistic resources in the future," he finished. The other students glanced back at her. Vidalia saw the guy who'd raised his eyebrow at her canvas actually snicker. What was everyone's problem? Vidalia felt her face flush. "As you know," said Monsieur Benoit, "we will be working in the museum this semester. Each of you will choose a painting to copy, and you will work on that for the rest of the course. Copying is a fundamental task of the artist," he went on. "Contrary to what many fashionable critics would tell you, there is no great artist who has not studied the old masters. We must pay them our respects and learn from them before we go on to do our own work." Everyone gazed up at him, like he was le maître, the master, Vidalia thought. She wasn't convinced. What kind of teacher started class by humiliating his students? "This week, we will work on various techniques that you will use in your copies. Beginning next Monday, 1 week from today, we will meet at the Musée Apollinaire promptly at 9 o'clock each morning." He looked pointedly at Vidalia, who bit her lip and felt her anger rise again. "I expect each of you to have completed a copy of your painting by the end of the program," he went on, looking around at everyone. "We won't be able to tell it from the original, correct, Bruno?" A guy with blonde hair and blue eyes laughed and said, "Of course not." Everyone chuckled knowingly. Why did it seem like they all knew each other on the first day of class? When Monsieur Benoit said they could go, a group of people gathered around him, talking. Vidalia, the blood rushing in her ears, headed for the door. As she pulled it open, the girl with dreadlocks slipped out alongside her. "T'inquiète pas," she said with a pitying look. "Don't worry. He's always like that in the beginning," she said in French. "Really?" Vidalia said incredulously as they walked down the long, quiet hallway. "Yes, he's just picking on you because you're new. The rest of us all took his spring class, so we've known him for some time." No wonder they all seemed so comfortable, Vidalia thought. "And he's probably pleased to have an American to tease as well," the girl said, looking up at Vidalia with an impish smile. "I'm Caroline," she added. "I'm Vidalia," she answered, really looking at the girl for the first time. She was fair with light freckles crossing the bridge of her nose. Her frame looked almost too small to support the mass of thick dreadlocks that hung down her back. "You can ask me questions if you need help," Caroline said, pushing open the door to the street. "And don't worry, Laurent will be nicer with you soon." She waved and turned to walk down the street away from the Boulevard Saint-Michel, where Vidalia was going. Feeling calmer, Vidalia looked across at the Seine and took a deep breath. She was hungry, she realized. She walked up the hill toward the boulevard. The sidewalks were crowded with people holding cameras and speaking different languages. She stopped in front of the first stand she saw that said crêpe and ordered one with ham and cheese, taking out the purse that Madame Dubois had given her. I have to tell Mom how good this is, she thought as she ate, and then remembered that she hadn't called home yet. Her mother had been in a near panic when Heather and her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Warren, had pulled up in front of the gate into Vidalia's yard to get her. "That's Heather," her mother had said, turning, hurried and breathless, to Vidalia, who was in the front hall checking for her passport. "Oh, have a wonderful time. You're going to love Paris." Her mother, dressed in a blue velour jumpsuit with a red turban wrapped around her head, fluttered between the fogged window next to the door and Vidalia, anxiety rising off of her like noxious fumes. "I will," said Vidalia. "I told Mr. Nichols to stop by every once in a while, so don't freak out if you see his truck." Mr. Nichols had been the groundskeeper when her mother was a kid, and the Sloan family was still one of the wealthiest in East Hampton. Now Vidalia called him when they needed a door fixed or a branch cut down, and half the time he wouldn't even take money for it. He also happened to be the only person, other than Vidalia, that her mother would allow inside the house. "I know," her mother said. "I'll expect him." "And Fresh Direct is coming Friday," Vidalia said. That was the online grocery delivery service that was going to keep her mother from starving while she was gone. "Yes, of course," her mother agreed, pushing her toward the door. "And don't forget to put that check for the power company out for the mailman tomorrow," Vidalia said. "Goodbye, darling," her mother said, and folded Vidalia in a brief hug, her neck moist against Vidalia's cheek in the humid afternoon. "I love you." Her voice was soft and less wild-sounding than it had been a moment before. "You too, Mom," Vidalia said, trying not to think about all the things that could go wrong while she was away. "I wish you'd let me call Aunt Pat so she could come over and check on you every once in a while." "No, you promised," her mother cried, immediately panicked. Okay, Vidalia said. "You're right, I promised." "Now go," her mother said. "You don't want to keep them waiting." Vidalia looked at her mother's face, the dark brown, almond-shaped eyes wide with panic, long lashes fluttering. She had been beautiful enough to model when she was younger, but now her face was so marked by anxiety and fear that her prettiness only came through in flashes. Vidalia had inherited her mother's pale skin and dark hair, but she was always aware that the beauty had somehow skipped a generation. She was too tall, for one thing, too skinny and flat-chested for another. She hugged her mother one last time. "You should get out of the house, too, Mom," she said. "Go for walks. I don't want you to be alone here the whole time I'm gone." It hadn't been that long ago that her mother did go out for walks, if only short ones. Vidalia was hoping that during her 6 weeks away, her mother would start going out again. In a way, this summer was a test to see if she could live on her own. After all, Vidalia would be leaving home for college the year after next. "Of course," her mother said. "Oh, darling, you should go," but she was holding onto Vidalia's arm, too, even as she was pushing her away. "Okay, I'm going," Vidalia said, carefully removing the tightly gripped hand. "I'll call you when I get there." Vidalia's mom stepped quickly away from the door as her daughter opened it, making sure that no one outside would catch a glimpse of her. That was her mother, frantic and loving, and always at home. She was probably waiting for the phone to ring right now. Once Vidalia had taken the last delicious bite of the crepe with its gooey cheese and soft shell, she looked around for a phone booth. Then she stepped inside the glass cabine and took the phone card from her bag, remembering Madame Dubois' instructions. "Hello?" Her mother's voice was high and expectant. It was about 20 after noon in Paris, which meant it was 6:20 a.m. at home, but Vidalia wasn't surprised to hear her mother wide awake at that hour. She got up early and did most of her gardening and cooking and redecorating in the morning. Afternoons were her lazy and often depressed time. "Hi, Mom," Vidalia said. "Vidalia!" she cried. "Where are you?" "Paris," she said, leaning back in the booth and looking out at the busy street. "Where do you think?" "Tell me everything," her mother said, ignoring the sarcasm. Vidalia looked down and scuffed the toe of her boot against the bumpy steel of the floor. "I started my art class today," she said with a sigh. "How was it?" her mother asked. "Did they peg you for the next Mary Cassatt?" Vidalia groaned. "It didn't go that well, actually." "Oh, never mind," her mother said when Vidalia had described her morning. "He's probably just testing you. The French are like that. But tell me about Paris. Where are you right now?" Saint-Michel, Vidalia said, looking at the name on the metro stop she could see from where she stood, right across the river from Notre Dame. Oh, there used to be the most wonderful English language bookstore, her mother sighed. Vidalia's mother had spent time in Paris when she was young, after she'd dropped out of college to model. She'd been telling Vidalia about it her entire life, so this wasn't the first time she'd mentioned the bookstore. Shakespeare and Company, her mother said. It's where all the American literary types would meet up, right across from Notre Dame, on the Saint-Michel side. You've got to go over there. I don't know if I'd call myself a literary type, Vidalia said. Vidalia, go, her mother cried. Do it for me. Okay, I'll see if it's still around, she sighed. Once she described the Dubois, the view from their apartment, and what the people on the street were wearing, Vidalia was ready to get off the phone. Mom, I should go. I don't want to use this whole card up at once, she said. And it's like 1,000,000 degrees in this phone booth, too. She opened and closed the glass door a few times, trying to create a breeze. Oh, of course, her mother said. Vidalia could see her sitting by the hall phone, wrapping the cord around her finger. Don't forget to call me, darling. I want to hear all about it, she said wistfully. I won't forget, said Vidalia. I'll call again soon. And let me give you the number for this cell phone I'm using, too. When her mother had written down the number and they'd hung up, Vidalia stepped out into the bright Parisian day. Art history didn't start until 2 o'clock, and it wasn't even 1 now. She decided to walk along the Seine, looking absent-mindedly for the bookstore as she went. She found it almost right away, tucked into a corner next to a cafe across from Notre Dame. In the courtyard in front of the glass storefront, there were shelves and a table piled with books. Several people stood outside reading and talking beneath a big yellow and black sign that read Shakespeare and Company. Vidalia crossed the street and went to look at one of the bookshelves. She scanned the spines of beat-up paperbacks, The Sheltering Sky, Ulysses, Nightwood, before noticing an olive-skinned arm moving quickly by her feet. There was a guy crouched on the ground next to her, taking books from a cardboard box and stacking them on a table. He wore faded jeans and a black t-shirt and had a mop of brown curls that gleamed in the sun and fell into his eyes. He glanced up at her. Can I help you find something? He asked, squinting up into the sun. He had a French accent. Non, merci, she said. Wait, he'd spoken English. Why had she answered in French? Vous êtes française? He asked. Are you French? Vidalia shook her head quickly, not sure which language to answer in now. English? He asked. He sat back on his heels. No, Swiss. This time Vidalia just smiled, playing along with his guessing game. He leaned back on one hand and really looked at her like he was thinking. I know, he said. You come from South Africa. He said it like he was sure he'd gotten it this time. I just fell out of the sky, she said, thinking of the painting in the Dubois' dining room, with my parachute. She raised her arms and whistled like she was falling. The guy shook his head and lifted the box of books as he stood. Walking toward the door to the store, he turned back to Vidalia. You Americans are so strange, he said, smiling at her, as he pulled the door open and went inside. Vidalia looked after him for a second, surprised and pleased with their little interaction. She'd made a joke with a French person. She turned back to the shelf for a minute before deciding to see what the inside of the store was like. She stepped into a room filled floor to ceiling with books. The guy was standing in front of a cash register. So I guess you like to read, Vidalia said, looking around at the books piled up on the floor, climbing crooked shelves to the ceiling. She was trying to be funny, but it came out kind of dumb. This is your first time at the store? He asked. Yeah, she said. My mother used to come here, though, a long time ago. She looked around again. It was hard to picture her mother standing among these shelves, leafing through a book, walking up to the register to pay. Of course, it was hard to picture her mother anywhere except inside their house these days. I'll give you a tour if you want. He tilted his head so that his curls fell out of his eyes. Sure, okay, she said. But you have to give it in French. You are French, aren't you? He laughed and was just about to say something, but just then a girl in a long skirt and a purple cloth wrapped around her head came hurtling through the door from the back. Julian, love, she said. She sounded Australian. I can't fit all those children's books up there. There's not enough room. She waved her hand at the ceiling in a fed-up gesture. He turned to her. "You have to make room," he said. Henry wants all the travel stuff moved to the front." "Where?" the girl asked pathetically. "I'll show you," he sighed. "Can you wait a minute?" he asked Vidalia. "Oh, actually," she knew she'd feel lame standing around waiting for him, and besides, she had to get to the Institute. He leaned over the register to grab what looked like a postcard. "Okay," he said, "but you should come back. There's a poetry reading tonight at 7:30. It's not in French," he grinned at her, "but he's quite good, right, Margie?" He held the card out to Vidalia, who took it. The girl in the doorway had her arms crossed and her eyebrows raised as she waited. "Andy's pretty good, yeah." She stretched the yeah out in a long Australian drawl. "Cool," Vidalia said. "I'll try to make it." "My name's Julien," he said, softening the J with his French accent. He smiled and put out his hand. It felt warm in Vidalia's. "I'm Vidalia," she said. "Really?" He leaned toward her, his eyes sparkling. "Alors, t'es un oignon?" Vidalia rolled her eyes. "Yeah," she said. "As you can see, I'm an onion." It wasn't the first time she'd heard the joke, but somehow she didn't mind it coming from him. He pulled his hand back and laughed, his brown eyes sparkling. "And this is Margie," he said. "Nice to meet you, Vidalia," Margie said matter-of-factly, before turning back to Julien. "Now can you please show me what I'm supposed to do up there? I've got to meet Michel in an hour." She turned and spun back through the door past a couple of customers who stood perusing the shelves. "Come to the reading," Julien said, "and we'll speak French." He flashed Vidalia a smile before disappearing into the back of the store. Vidalia stared for a second at the door that Julien and Margie had gone through. What do you know, she thought. Her mother had pointed her in the right direction for once. She looked at the card and tucked it into her bag as she headed out the door to the metro. She was looking forward to tonight already. And that's part of the beginning. The story goes on from there. So I can answer any questions anybody has about Vidalia, about YA.
Some of your authors that you admire are like Haruki Murakami, Neil Gaiman, and Andre Breton, and they have really surreal styles. I was going to ask if you see a direct reflection of that in Vidalia in Paris or in your future projects?
Surreal styles?
Yes.
Well, no. I mean, I think that a lot of the writers and artists that I love and admire play into the book just kind of in Vidalia's interests and the things that she's exposed to, more than the style. But the style, for this, the style is not experimental in any way, obviously. It's a straightforward narrative story. And that's the way that I wanted it, just to sort of, like I said, pull the reader in and keep going from beginning to end.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Hi, thank you for coming. That was wonderful.
Thanks, Ron.
I'd like to ask you if you have any other plans for the character of Vidalia.
I do. I would like, ideally, to write 2 more books about Vidalia and to have it be a trilogy. I haven't started on that yet. I'm writing another book, as I said, that's not related. So I do have other plans. I'd like her to go back to Paris, for one thing, and a couple of the characters I'd like to have come back to. And I'd also like to spend more time with the mother character, so to do something back at her home where the mother is explored more deeply.
Hi, Sasha. So you mentioned that you like to interact with the teenagers and the audience of the book. Have you set up any online forum or some kind of space where you can interact with these people?
Well, I have a website. I have a website that's a blog and that can be commented on, and I encourage readers to comment on it. And actually, that's one of the things about writing for kids, writing for young people, that's interesting, is that they are obviously very much online, and so there's just a lot more contact than ever I had with authors when I was a kid. Readers have blogs. There are so many young teenage readers who have blogs about books, and they get in touch with the authors and they interview the authors. I just got an email from a 13-year-old the other day who does that, and she said, I love your book and I'd like to interview you. Can I send you the question? I said, sure.
So I guess, could you say the address of your website for
Oh, yeah,
the
it's-
camera? And if people ask you questions, then you will answer them
Yes,
on your website.
absolutely, absolutely. And there's also, my email address is on the website too, so I can be directly emailed. But the website is www.sashawatson.com, .sashawatson.com. And that, VidaliaInParis.com goes to the same place, so either one.
So I have a question.
Okay.
It's kind of a follow-up to Tommy's question, and that is, so in the space of a novel, of a novel for young adults, how do you interest your young readers in the books that interested you maybe when you were younger or interest you as an adult? I mean, how do you, what ways do you find to sort of get that in there, or is that something that you think about?
Into the
and-
book
yeah.
itself? Yeah, I mean, just in throwing in titles for one thing, and then Julian, the character of Julian he's a literary guy. He's a freshman in college and he studies American literature, so he tends to talk about American literature. And in this book, I sort of, was thinking of course, the writers that had clustered around Shakespeare and Company, and those, the books that I mentioned, Sheltering Sky and Nightwood, were all books that were written in Paris and by people who spent time in Paris. So those mentions, and then, I mean, in this book, it's more the art. It's more the visual arts that I sort of go into and describe in much more detail. And Vidalia sees a lot of art and reacts to it and thinks about it. And I used the acknowledgments in this book as a way of getting a lot of that stuff in there too. And I just wanted to leave some clues for readers, of like little, names and places, things that they might be interested in. And so I acknowledged sort of artistic influences in the acknowledgments for that reason.
Sorry if you already mentioned this, but what, if any, of this is autobiographical?
Ah, good question. I spent a lot of time in Paris growing up. I was there as a child, and then I spent some time in high school and college, after college. So I've lived in Paris off and on throughout my life. And I guess I would say what's autobiographical is just the experience of being a young American in Paris and being sort of tossed into this culture and coming up against the differences. We tend to think of, Europe, us as sort of these Western cultures as being very similar. And I think once you are, the closer you get to it, the more you realize how deep the differences do go. And so I really wanted to write about that, just about what it was like to be an American kid, suddenly. And for Vidalia, a lot of that comes through in the art training, because her art training at home has been very spontaneous and creative, in the way that American art is taught, for the most part in schools. And then she winds up, as you saw, in this very rigorous, sort of strict classical French class. And it starts to go better after that scene. But
Okay, well then I'll ask another question,
Okay.
actually, if that's okay. So my question is about gender. And the question is, in young adult fiction, I guess the first question is, because it's a female protagonist, it seems maybe more oriented toward girls. And I guess my question is, it just made me curious about what about boys, and what differences do you see between the fiction that's sort of more, I guess, focused on a girl readership and focused on a boy readership? And I thought, what's the difference? And here's an expert in the subject, so
Yeah.
it'd be an interesting question. So
this is something that gets talked about a lot in children's and in young adult fiction, is, and the way that it's usually framed is like, how to get boys to read. How are we going to get boys to read more? Because the common wisdom is that girls just read much more than boys, and girls will sort of read anything, but boys are less likely to read books that are about female characters. So people refer to boy books a lot. I'm writing a boy book now. The next book that I'm writing is a boy character. And in the writing, I would say that nothing much is different. I'm writing about a boy, but the writing itself is the same. But I've actually been really pleasantly surprised since I've been going into classes, because I was so prepped for this, lack of interest on the part of boys. And I've done a bunch of creative writing workshops with girls and boys, and I walked in really expecting, some percentage of the kids to be really interested, and I thought they would, for the most part, be girls. And that really wasn't the case. Boys, were just as interested and just as much like furiously writing during the writing exercises and wanting to read their work. And so I've found that, you know, in person to be, I mean, I guess the statistics are what they are, but I think that, you know, there's lively interest out there from boys too. And there are a few books, there's one book in particular that's really hitting both right now, girls and boys. And, you know, there are a lot of books that do this, but there's a book called The Hunger Games that's out right now that just came out recently by Suzanne Collins, and it's a sort of sci-fi, futuristic, dystopic worldview, and it's a wonderful book. It's an amazing book. And boys, it's a female main character, but boys and girls are reading that book, you know, across the board. So there are books like that too.
Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you very much, Sasha.
Thank you.